Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. In this weekly podcast, Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I am Hannah Bratterud.
And I'm Luke Freeman. And today I'm super excited to have a returning guest and a friend and a mentor and my old youth pastor way back in the day. I'm trying to think of all the different contexts.
Right.
A professor, maybe? Did you ever teach a class that I was in?
I don't think so. I didn't have you in class.
Okay, so not a professor. Never mind. Forget that.
He is a professor, though.
Well, he
He wasn't
I'm going to
yours.
read the bio in a second. Yeah. So, Dr. Greg Robinson. So, Greg, here's your bio. Dr. Greg Robinson is currently the Associate Professor of Outdoor Leadership Ministries at John Brown University. Previously, Program Director for HoneyRock, the Outdoor Center for Leadership Development of Wheaton College, as well as President of Challenge Quest LLC in Pryor, Oklahoma, and Managing Member of Adventure Quest Recreation. Greg has a Ph.D. in Organizational Behavior and Leadership from the Union Institute and University in Cincinnati, also an MS in Counseling from John Brown University. Greg's professional career has concentrated in areas of experiential learning, team development, leadership development, facilitation, and consulting with organizational change efforts. He's the author of Leadership Paradox, Teams for a New Generation, Adventure in the Way of Jesus, and Lessons of the Way, and Leading from Where You Are. His family includes his wife of 32 years, Jeannie, daughter Keely, and her partner Nick, his sons Kobe and Kyle, as well as two grandsons, Lucas and Max. And super excited to have you here. Anything I missed? Should we add anything? Take anything off?
I did have one more book come out since that was written.
Yeah. Okay. We'll plug that.
Yeah, it's called Leaders Yet Discovered.
Ooh,
So
I like
it is written to programs that work primarily with emerging leaders and how to help them begin to think through the processes and stuff they need for that. It's not this is what you should be teaching or doing, but these are the things to consider.
So internally, how do you lead yourself if you want to lead others? Is that part of it or?
But it's, so it's written primarily to two contexts. I'll just say that it's written to camps and colleges.
Yep.
Both places that work with young adults, 18 to 22 years old. And how do you intentionally develop them from where they are?
Yeah.
And if you read the research, the big critique on all the emerging leader stuff is there's no consistent theory. There's no models. There's just a collection of traditions and whatever. And we suggest, and I co-wrote it with Rob Ribby, who's the executive director at HoneyRock, that with just a little bit more intentionality, you could really create a place that produces leaders that are pretty capable. So
Yeah. And we also know that how we treat people and how we perceive that others view us has a huge impact on who we become and what we actually end up doing in life.
Yeah.
So when I read this, what I think is also helpful for listeners is kind of hidden in here is a lot of your experience with large organizations, publicly traded organizations, both as a director of organizational development for a time, but then also as a consultant who's worked with a lot of executive leadership teams, departmental functional leadership teams, helped create strategies, but also helped shape mindset around what does it mean to be a member of this team? What does it mean to be a leader in this context? And so what I really appreciate about Greg and his approach is this combination of understanding the structures and the pressures and the systemic issues that leaders in large organizations face, and really organizations of all size, and then also coming at it from a people development perspective with this experience in retreat center, leadership development, higher education. How do we really form people into leaders that are sustainable, right? For the lack of a better word, and to be brief. So, So I'm excited to have a conversation. We've been talking about internally as a team quite a bit, this idea of like work plus community, and maybe plus isn't the right word. Maybe it's more of an overlap, or maybe it's more of a, how much of the community flavor do we taste inside a work climate? And I know that you're someone who's done a lot of thinking about community and a lot of work with community. And, I'll just say the why of this is we think that there's a different expectation for something that feels like community from a lot of folks in the workplace. I think we've seen that over the last couple of years. That trend has sped up. And then the other thing is, as we think about what we do as a company at Purpose and Performance Group, we've started to think more about, rather than, well, what we do is help people clarify purpose and build practices that elevates, clarifies, behavioralizes their purpose across their organization. Like, yes, we do that, but the outcome and the why oftentimes is community building, and that leads to higher performance for the organization. So, we're really still forming some of these thoughts. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So,
Yeah.
So I'm curious, maybe to kick us off, like, what's community? Feels like a little bit of a loaded word to me.
Yeah. I teach a grad class on this, and I introduce them to two potential ways of thinking about community. One would have to be, it is a particular quality of interaction that we're trying to create and sustain. And I think that's the one that people are most familiar with. The other way of thinking about it too is, it is a collection of people who work together to protect a way of life.
Okay. Interesting.
And I think that on rare occasions in communities or even an organization where there is a really well-developed, healthy culture, you might find people that are willing to do whatever it takes to protect that way of life. But I think most people, when they come into a setting and they're talking about community, they're really talking about some, for them, often ill-defined quality of interaction that they're looking for. I don't think it's that much different. I think there's a lot of overlap with the word collaboration.
Yeah.
And I think that, I'll start off by being a contrarian here. So I think the aspiration for community is noble, and I think any leader would be smart to think about it. But I think if we're not careful, it's just trying to put a new word on something we've been trying to do in organizations for a long time and haven't been very successful.
Okay.
So if you look at the stats, 80 to 90% of executives will say collaboration, teamwork, cross-departmental boundaries, essential for our success. In the same studies, 20 to 25% say they know how to do it. And those numbers have been solid and consistent for 20 to 25 years.
Okay. So we're saying this is what we want. We don't know how to do it.
Right. So what I'm hoping that you guys will be able to do is help break through the understanding, because if community just becomes, in the 90s, it was teamwork. In the 2000s, it's been collaboration. If the new word is community, but you still end up functioning in the same way, you're just going to burn out the word. So
right. And we use the word culture a lot, which plays into what we're talking about here too, right? It's part of our culture. And to what extent does culture overlap with community, and how, or I think a community has a culture.
Absolutely.
Right. And so, and I think what we've been grappling with too is, so culture exists whether we're intentional about creating it or not.
Right.
And is that culture conducive to community or not? I don't know. Those are just some things I've been thinking about.
Yeah. I would think about culture as the way of life that community may want to protect.
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting when you said some people may do whatever it takes to protect that way of life. We see that go horribly wrong sometimes too.
Absolutely.
Right? When it becomes about protecting the thing And then you start behaving in ways that are actually counteracting the thing that you were trying to protect.
Sure. It doesn't take much distraction.
Yeah.
Once you have the tightness of the community, if the thing that orients you in this world turns negative, that very healthy thing can very quickly become destructive.
Yeah. And we've seen that with various cults and different things that happen in society, right?
Absolutely.
We become so fervent about protecting this thing that we've created or feel some kind of stake in.
Mm-hmm.
And then it turns negative and it turns into hatred and causes conflict.
Yeah. So there always has to be some kind of orienting core to your community, culture, values, whatever you want to talk about.
When we talk about purpose a lot as kind of the rallying cry, the North Star, we talk about what's in the center of our circle. What is it that we orient towards?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that works really well too. What I struggle with a lot is I think we live in a culture that wants to externalize everything. So purpose becomes a set of actions, a strategy, a set of tactics. Culture becomes a set of behaviors, phrases. Leadership is about skills and information. All of those things lack an interior core, an interior identity or character capable of carrying out what we aspire to.
Ooh.
And we don't like doing that kind of work. It's harder.
Yeah.
It's longer.
Yeah.
It's inefficient. And so
it's hard to quantify. It's hard to measure.
Absolutely. So we tend to default to the things that we can count and watch.
Yeah.
Gives us an illusion of control. But in the end, we're continually disappointed that there is a lack of depth. And we tend to be surprised when things go sideways, if all you're doing is trying to imitate a set of descriptors, when the pressure comes, your character can't hold up to it.
Oh, man. Is that why this is so hard? Our very first episode on this podcast, and we're way over 100 in now, but it was about why is this so hard? I think was the title of it, right? And it's about why is this leadership thing so hard?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting, Hannah, because here we are, 2.5 years later.
Yeah.
And I think it's still hard, right? But we're using some different words around it. Like we would say, because it's character development.
Right.
Right. It's what I hear Greg saying. And when you ask someone, hey, is character development, should that be easy? I think most people would say, no, that's probably hard to develop character, right? They even say if kids are out running at sports practice in the heat and it's hard, to say, oh, they're building character, right? But for some reason, we expect as leaders to not have to keep doing those sprint drills to build character, right? Internally, emotionally for ourselves. And I do think purpose not being a checklist, a strategy, a set of initiatives that we're running really is dependent on a community being circled around what it's for, but that thing that it's for being what's the highest possible good that this community can create,
right,
for itself, for the world that it's placed in, right? And so if we think about outcomes, like purpose as being focused on outcomes, what's the highest possible good that we can create, rather than what's the best possible way we can act, right? Then that becomes that, Simon Sinek's thing, the infinite game, right?
Sure.
Around, well, how do we continue to create that highest possible good?
And I would say that a lot of, because I know who you guys work with a lot of your clients, they probably understand this protect a way of life thing way more than any of the rest of us.
Yeah.
And I think there's some things there that we could learn from them. And they're not usually the first place organizational experts look and say, okay, what are they doing? They kind of get forgotten in history.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I mean, for folks listening, I think you're referencing like tribal enterprise, right? Businesses owned and operated for a Native American tribe. And, there is a little bit of a paradox there, because I think you're right. I think understanding that an enterprise exists to create resource for a community, yes, right? That's bedrock, that's DNA. Now, what I think we've seen happen is that people have felt like they've needed to make excuses for that, right? And they've said, well, people have said the only way you can create resource for your community is if you take all of these transactional practices and you get all the MBAs to come in, and they're going to tell you how you can maximize resource for your community,
right?
In a way that's really unaligned with
the values
what you go home and the values that the community actually practices with their neighbors, right? So being able to untrain that, unlearn some of that, and say, no, there's a way forward that creates resource for a community and is really explicit that that's what we're doing. And it also means that our workplace is an extension of that community that people are invited into. And, there's folks who might be part of one community and not the other. And, it's a little bit messy and complicated, but doing that dance and that work of how do we reflect the values of our tribe in this instance in the enterprise that exists for its resource.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that I think, and that's why I think it's difficult for businesses, maybe even organizations of all types. I'm not saying it can't be done, but this will be a sticking point for some. So if you look at how a lot of we'll call them societal communities exist, there's a different kind of commitment there than there is in other settings. So you can think about commitments in terms of contractual agreements or vows. So typically in organizations, we have very contractual agreements. You say you're going to do this, I'm going to do that. As long as we're both doing it, everything's fine.
Yeah.
One of us stops doing it, contract's broken, relationship goes away or whatever. But in real community, commitment is a set of vows that you take. It is a commitment that you make to an unknown future. And you're willing to be with the others because generation after generation, families have grown up there, replaced the people that were before them, took their spot in that community, and it rolls through history.
Yeah.
But the only way you do that is you got to be willing to make a commitment to people without absolutely knowing the potential outcome that you're committing to in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of organizations will have trouble with that.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean that you can never remove somebody from your community. Obviously, someone's destructive.
Right.
But removal is not the first instinct.
Right. It's not the first choice. It's last
result.
resort.
Absolutely.
Right. Do you think that in instances where removal is like the quickest first resort, right? The instinct, how much of that is connected to like the dehumanization of people as resources?
I think a lot of that is there. I think it's, you keep a certain amount of distance, so if you're going to enter into community, you can't keep everybody at distance.
Yeah.
One of the things that actually makes a community is that we move from I stories to we stories.
Yeah.
And we're willing to collapse some of our stories into this bigger story because it gives the context and purpose of our individual stories. You do that, you get close to people, you get to know them, you get to care about them, and they're going to go through rough spots, and they're going to be bored, and they're going to need something different. And we're as a society in the U.S., we're just not very good at any of this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about this, and I've kind of been exploring, empathy and the role of empathy and how empathy works. And, what was kind of eye-opening to me was this thought, and when I learned, and it makes sense when you think about it experientially, we can recognize it, right? But I'd never thought of it before until it was pointed out in a book I was reading. Empathy is like a spotlight. So we can have empathy for an individual, for a small group of people that are close to us. We can have empathy within a community. We're not able to empathize with a really wide range of, like, we're not wired, like empathy doesn't work in that way where we can't have empathy for a whole group of people, like a whole population. And so that's the tricky thing about empathy, because when I'm in community with you, I'm better set up to have empathy for you. But that's also when everybody else becomes the other, right? And so when we otherize people, and that's what gives way to supremacist thinking. And every human being is capable of supremacist thinking, because it's, well, we don't do things that way, or I could never do this thing that these people are doing. And it's dehumanizing and it's otherizing. So for me, what's interesting about community is it's kind of the antidote to that. And at the same time, it can turn negative, as we started out with, if it becomes like hatred of everybody that's not part of this way of life.
Right. Yeah. I think it's Peter Block. He writes about this move from I story to we story. And he said the way it always works is it is a deep dive into yourself so that you have a honest understanding of who you are that then reaches out in solidarity to the other. So I think empathy plays into that, that we can't necessarily empathize to 1,000 people.
Right.
But we can empathize to representatives of that, which then moves us closer to being listen first, judge second kind of mentality. I think that's what we're trying to move towards.
Yeah.
And so I like the word solidarity because what it requires of us is to recognize not only the humanity in the other person, but the similarity in our experience.
Yeah.
So find the thing where we're alike.
Yes.
I think we struggle with that. We tend to focus on the differences and we dismiss that the other person could be like us.
Right.
And sometimes that's on purpose and sometimes it's just
exactly
habit, so.
Yeah. And that's where, where some of this thinking started for me was I was listening to a episode of Simon Sinek's podcast, A Bit of Positivity, I think it's called. It was a while back and I can't remember the name of the guest, but she has this kind of philosophy on diversity training that's very different from how it's done typically in organizations. And it has to do with this thing of recognizing in me the ability or the potential for supremacist thinking when I think that I'm better than somebody else, or that I make better, more moral, more ethical choices. But being able to recognize that the behavior that we're dismissing and that we're judging, when we can see in ourselves how we also do that, when we have that level of kind of self-insight and reflection, we can actually see the other person as more human because we can recognize that we have a shared experience.
Absolutely. I think someone who does this probably as well as anybody that I know of is a guy by the name of Greg Boyle. He's a priest who runs a gang intervention.
Yes.
Homeboy Industries in East LA.
I've heard about him. Yeah.
And when you hear him talk about it, he always talks about this idea of kinship. Yeah. So he comes in, he's part of the community. He does not help from a place of other. He helps from a place of solidarity.
Yeah.
And what that creates, which is almost always required if community is going to be a reality, is this mutual benefit, mutual influence, mutual benefit. There's a deep mutuality to it all. Yeah. And I think we have to figure out how to do that. It makes it harder to just lay people off when you're done with them, but it depends on what you're looking for.
Right.
And I think we live in a time when speed, efficiency has, there's nothing wrong with any of those things, but I think they've they've grown out of proportion to their benefit.
Yeah. And I think part of that is there's the speed of information, the access to information, everything moves at a faster pace, and our brains have not maybe fully adapted to that yet. There's also within companies, the whole, for publicly traded companies, the shareholder return when performance is only measured in 3-month increments,
Right.
the quarterly returns, like that has trained that into companies to, just go for short-term measures, right? That can fix the optics within this very artificial short window of time.
Right. Yep. Those are all the pressures working against this idea. And yet I think you're seeing people being unwilling to live without this.
Yeah. And companies are finding it almost impossible to hire and retain people.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, and I think the younger members of the workforce, I don't know if they want it more than previous generations, but they're certainly not willing to tolerate not having it.
Yeah. And they're more vocal about it. And they recognize that they have options
Yep.
and they're willing to exercise choice
Yep.
and go somewhere else.
Yep. Unfortunately, they're not any better at creating it.
They're not
than
better
the
at
people that
creating
came,
it.
came
And the next
before them.
place you go to is probably not going to be a lot better at doing that thing. Right?
Yeah. So tell me more about that. So I know you're connected to a lot of folks who are just entering the workforce. So, examples, stories, or just share a little bit more around those changing expectations, that you're seeing. And then like, okay, so if there's a new expectation, like what would I do that would meet the expectation?
Yeah. So I think we have an unfortunate conversion of forces here, and at times they work against each other. So I do think there is an awareness among, the emerging generations that what has been going on before just doesn't work very well. Their parents weren't very happy. The grandparents weren't very happy. There's got to be a better way of doing it. So let's figure that out. But then they also are not schooled very well in this idea of personal responsibility. So you cannot have a healthy community unless all the members have high levels of personal responsibility.
Yeah. Wow.
And so they look around, and the thing that actually keeps them separated that they don't realize is they want to belong so bad that they are afraid of being themselves. They're afraid of stepping up. They're afraid of initiating a contribution because that might not work. It might reflect badly on them.
Yeah.
I teach a class, it's called Leadership and Professional Etiquette. And basically every week students come in, it's usually 20, 25 students in a class, and I give them this major problem solving thing. And the goal is we want to look at their tendencies as leaders, as a part of the group. And they will work, we'll sit down, we go to debrief it, and they just sit and stare at me. I'm like, what's going on? We finally realize that there is a threshold of belonging that has to get crossed before people jump in and then start making the contributions that they have.
Interesting.
That they walk right up to it. They want it. They can maybe even see it.
Yeah.
But they cannot make themselves take the risk. And so they're waiting for people to give them permission to belong.
Right.
And that's where I think this personal responsibility, this maturity thing that says, I don't need you to validate me.
Yeah.
I can be me. I can make a contribution knowing that could benefit you. And when it's mutual, then that's when, the sparks fly. But we're held back from getting what we want most because we're afraid of what it's going to take for us to get it.
So do I hear you right? If I were to rephrase this and say, in order to create community and in order for there to be any hope of community at the workplace, we first have to create belonging and create a way for people to belong.
Absolutely. There's a some research would suggest it is the strongest drive within the human being is to belong.
I believe that fully.
And so Daniel Coyle wrote a great book, Culture Code. He talks all about belonging, safety, safety being probably the most important thing for a team. And what's interesting is most of the time our unconscious process is examining the context for threat. And loneliness will actually create a sensitivity that pushes away belonging. If you're lonely for too long, you begin to distrust the very thing you want.
Yeah. I've never thought of it that way, but I've seen it play out with humans.
Yeah. But once there is belonging, the same processes that look for threat get off the threat and start looking for connection.
Right.
And so we are wired to belong, but we have to figure out how to help people experience
and as
that.
I've been also learning more about how our nervous system works, right? The nervous system is always seeking to connect or protect. So if we're in a position where we don't feel like we belong, we feel lonely, we feel isolated, we get into the protective mechanisms a lot more, right? And it's harder to switch over. And part of it is becoming aware of when we're in protect mode and choosing to intentionally connect. And I do think if we don't feel safe enough to do that on a neurological level or physiological level, whatever the perception of threat is, whether it's physical, psychological, we tend to go inward. Even body language, facial expressions, everything starts closing down and self-protecting. And it's really hard to create real connection. Now we're getting a little bit off topic, but if you can learn how to connect with yourself first, it's hard to connect with others when you're disconnected from yourself.
Yep.
But I think it goes a little bit to this concept of becoming intentional about belonging. Where do I want to belong? Where do I choose intentionally not to belong? And we'll do another episode on belonging as a topic. Luke and I have spent a lot of time talking about that and developing some thinking and framework around it. But there's different levels of connection and belonging, right? There's self, there's we, there's also the moment, the context we're in.
Right.
And you mentioned, before we started recording here, you mentioned this idea of temporary community. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, because that's like belonging to a time and space in a temporary setting to a set of individuals or context or cause or whatever it might be. But can you share a little bit more about that and maybe how that plays into work life as well?
Yeah. So temporary community is an endeavor that has a predetermined stopping point that everybody knows. Yeah. And, that could be 2 days, that could be 2 years. I mean, college is a 4-year temporary community.
Right.
If you do what you're supposed to, in 4 years, you get to graduate, you're going to move on. But but there is a defined end to that. And the things we know about temporary community is there tends to be much more heightened connection to the organizing purpose of that temporary community. There is an effortlessness to the work to accomplish that purpose. People just give themselves to it. They will work harder.
I wouldn't say college was effortless. But
well, that one's a long one. But they tend to, really give themselves to it. There is often a breaking down of hierarchies inside those, which I think is essential to forming community at a certain level. And I recognize that there are positions in organizations, there's this idea of authority and those kinds of things. And we're not trying to say you got to get rid of all that.
Sure.
But what we're saying is inside these temporary communities, people will often set that aside. So they're more open to experimenting with being a different kind of person. They learn language that's different. They try things on. If it doesn't work, no problem. You go back to your real life. But if something does work, now we've learned something that we want to take back and integrate into our culture and way of being. So I think it's a very useful tool. I think it used to be in the 90s. Obviously, that was the heyday of a lot of, outdoor adventure based, and those things were always
like ropes course type of things.
Those things were always, anywhere from a half day to 2 or 3 days long. And I don't think we fully understood what we had back then. Most people did it for the excitement, for the bonding. What they didn't understand was the potential for the formational impact if it was done with a certain kind of intention.
Interesting. So could a conference or a retreat be a form of temporary community?
Absolutely.
So is that maybe also why we feel like there's this kind of high that comes off of that experience and everything? I mean, that's how it feels often, effortless. We connect in this way and it feels really meaningful. And then we go back to quote unquote real life.
Right.
And it's not like that.
Right.
But what I'm also hearing, though, is this opportunity for role exploration. When you're away or in this other context for a short amount of time, maybe it's different people than who you interact with every day, you have the opportunity to explore different identity, explore different roles before you commit to it, but you get to try it on.
Absolutely. And it's even if you are doing it as a team, so you're not doing it as an individual. So this is a team building kind of thing. One of the things that you often have to do in order to make a leap in performance is you have to get past the established assumptions that have just become second nature to you.
Right.
Temporary community puts people in a novel environment. That's one of the pieces that gives you the energy. It's novel. Most people aren't the expert in whatever that is.
Yeah.
And that's where you get some of the leveling that kind of happens. And you begin to see people differently than you do every day. And it is the surfacing, challenging, and perhaps breaking of those assumptions that we're unaware of that is the real formative work that's being done there.
Right.
So I'm just sitting here absorbing all of this. When I think about what does this mean for like the average leader, I think if I'm listening to the conversation, there's a good chance that I feel really intimidated, right? Because we'll go back to kind of where we started, that if I'm building community on my team or my organization, that's an act of character development for me as a leader. And also, there's a kind of a lot of technical, psychological talk that's being thrown out here. Like, I don't know how to do that, right? And part of this is, I think, as a culture, we don't talk about leadership very much. There are some leadership tracks that people take, but we don't have shared language around even what are our expectations for a community at work and what's the role of a leader in creating that. So I guess, if we were going to kind of strip away some of the theory, which I know the three of us all love, what are the 2 or 3 things that, would be most beneficial as maybe a practice or as a structural intervention? We change our meeting agenda. We go somewhere once a quarter for a half day. So yeah, I don't want to say those are the things, but I'm curious, Greg, what comes to mind when you get practical?
I think there's a process that I have taught for a long time to teams. I try to embed it because it's often in an organization. It's not about doing something new. It's about doing what you're already doing, just do it a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
So assuming you've got meetings in your interaction in an organization, you've got the infrastructure to do what we're talking about. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to start a whole bunch of stuff that you don't, but what you do in those meetings make a tremendous difference.
Yeah.
So it's kind of it's a set of ideas. I call it action learning. That term's been around for a long time. I tend to lean a little bit more towards the understanding that came out from Europe than in the US. US action learning is really kind of temporary assignments given to executives. But what I'm talking about is a quality of interaction whereby a small group of people learn to think together about an issue they're trying to understand. And so there's 3 primary mindset values that kind of guide us. It's not a complicated thing, but it takes some practice.
Yeah.
Because we're so easy at getting distracted from it.
Right.
So the first one is managing boundaries, recognizing that it's not my job to fix you. It's not your job to fix me. Scott Peck in his book, A Different Drum, which is probably the best book I've ever read on community building, will talk about this in a stage called emptiness, where we cease to try to heal and convert the other. So I recognize the issue. If it's your issue. I'm helping you with your thing. I'm not trying to take over your thing. And we manage that, which allows us to give and receive help. The second one is probably the most important one, and it is sharing our ignorance. That we come together not to be the smartest person in the room, but we come to talk about what we don't know together.
Yeah.
So there's a humility here. There is a offering of ideas. They're often, I talk about, you offer it as a gift. If it's helpful, they take it. If it's not, then fine. We'll move on to the next one. Ego gets stripped out of it because I'm not mad because you didn't take my idea, because I'm not trying to get you to take my idea. I'm just putting something out there and see if it works.
Right.
And then the third one is diversity, is to get as many different perspectives as you can represented so you don't get tunnel vision on something too quickly. And so what you take your traditional staff meeting, which is 90% information sharing, the lowest form of interaction you can do, and it's extremely expensive. So do that another way. And what you do is you build a setting where people can trust each other enough to come and say, this is my problem.
Yeah.
This is what I can't fix. I need your help on this. And I did it initially because it seemed like a simple structural change to help groups. What I found out was it's extremely formational for all the people in it. Because the multitude of people that do it come back to me and they say, well, that follows me around. I listen in every meeting differently. I talk to people differently.
Yeah.
I react to people differently because you've practiced a way of being. I just taught a class in the spring. It's called Leadership in Human Systems. So it's a Monday, Wednesday class. And every Wednesday, the students come in and they do action learning in these small groups.
Cool.
And by the end of the semester, I started noticing I had 4 or 5 people that weren't even taking the class. They would just come in on Wednesdays to do action learning with my team. And at the end of it, they said, you need to figure out how to get everybody to have to take this class.
Yeah.
You talk about emerging generations and what they're looking for. This is not complicated.
Right.
There's a little process to it. You need to practice it. You got to figure out how you get off track. But you don't have to have enormous amounts of psychological training. Matter of fact, I did a study on it back in probably 2002, and I compared about 30 action learning groups. About half of them were led by me, the expert, and the other half were led by volunteers that I trained. And the outcomes were the same.
Right.
So it wasn't in who the facilitator was. It was just, do I understand the process?
Right.
That, to me, that's a simple place to start.
Yeah.
That sounds really inefficient.
It is very inefficient. If you're thinking about today, part of why community is so hard to build regardless of where you do it, and why it's extremely hard to build in organizations is we're unwilling to waste time today practicing something we don't need till tomorrow. The problem is when we get to when we need it, if we haven't been practicing, it's too late.
Yeah.
You'll never have it.
Yeah.
And the organizations that I've seen, I mean, this is probably the best story. I taught it to a group of IT professionals at an energy company here in Tulsa, they were starting up a new kind of organization, new way of doing it. And they needed a way to learn their way through this. And so action learning, you come in, person puts an issue on the table. First thing the group needs to do is ask a bunch of questions to get to the root. 90% of the time, the issue we present to other people is not the issue, it's the symptom.
Right. Yeah.
So your group's first responsibility is to help you clarify what the real issue is.
Okay.
Once that's done, then they can start helping you brainstorm, think through alternatives for ways that you can go about doing that. And then, as the person who puts the issue on the table, your commitment is, I'm going to go do something with this.
Yeah.
Right. It's not hypothetical. I'm going to go do something with it. And then I'll come back and I'll tell you how it went.
Right.
If it worked, then we'll all know why it worked. And if it didn't work, then we'll start over. So this group, they were really experimenting with self-management. I mean, I think at their peak, they had one manager for 70 something employees.
Wow.
So you want to talk about efficiency. If you make the investment, you can get some efficiency. And the company they work for went through a significant downturn, kind of in the wake of Enron, some of that stuff back then. And what I noticed is that all the organizational components around them, the performance was just crumbling. And this group's performance stayed. It survived the downturn. It survived an outsourcing of most of the IT functions, that when internal customers had the choice, they would come to this group versus the outside group because this group was better. They knew they would get the work done.
Yeah.
And it was because they built a culture. They built a way of being together, way of life. And, if you go back and you talk to the manager and director, action learning wasn't the only cause of it, but it was one of the significant building blocks of that culture. They learned to listen differently, to work together differently, take responsibility differently. All of which would have never happened for this group.
Right.
So,
yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to move towards closing, but I have one more question for you.
Okay.
Do you think it's a moral obligation for a leader to build some level of community?
I would say yes. But I tend to ascribe to a more servant leadership view of things.
Yeah.
I think the leader's responsibility is to build the healthiest context that person can build for the people that work with them in it.
Yeah.
But not only is it a moral imperative, it's actually the smartest thing to do. If you look at what deters leaders, what limits organizations, what is the downfall behind most failures, it's this lack of healthy belonging. And so if you want to be good for a long time, you do this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hannah, what's going to stick with you from today's conversation?
Oh man, this was so rich, and I already have other books and things to look up and dive deeper. This has been a really interesting conversation, but yeah, I think, Greg, for me, this whole idea of how hard it can be to build community, especially inside a company because of how it's structured, right? Like that is going to take some time for me to think through and process, like, what are the implications of that? And can we do business differently? If we value community, what does that look like? And yeah, I think there's just a lot of practical lessons to take away, like action learning. I want to learn more about it. I want to learn how to facilitate it. It sounds really useful. So as a practical tool, I appreciate that. And, something I'll definitely dive deeper into. But yeah, for me, the big question is, as we've had this kind of ongoing conversation about community-based employment, disruptive, holistic compensation, what are some of the outcomes, right, that a company can strive for? Because we know that the, profit outcomes, they are an outcome, but that's all. It's an outcome. If that becomes a goal in and of itself, it doesn't feel as healthy as something that has a focus on other outcomes, right? So, if we have better community, we have better well-being, we have healthier systems, healthier humans, I think it just creates more goodness all the way around for everyone involved.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, for me, a couple of things stand out. One, I thought it was really insightful to talk about community as a continuation of collaboration in the 2000s, teamwork, team building in the 90s. I think for folks listening, if that helps you, right, and you're like, hey, my people are asking for a community, they want some sort of more meaningful, fulfilling work. Well, okay, you don't have to say community. Like if you have to go sell it to someone, you can talk about collaboration, because at the core, it's the same thing. The other thing that's helpful to me about that is that it does also capture this widening of the influence of our work. It's not just about, oh, we have good teamwork when I'm here in these four walls. It's not just collaboration. Oh, we have good teamwork and we're creative and create things together that I couldn't do by myself. Now it's also, we work well together, right? And we create amazing things that I couldn't do by myself. And this space is a place where I belong, like my unique self, who I am. And I believe in why we're all doing this together. So I do think there's a developmental progression there for organizations and honestly for the expectation of the workforce. So that's one takeaway. The other is that leaders, like the responsibility of a leader. And we know that most people who leave a job are leaving a leader. They're not leaving an organization. And so I think for folks who take that stat seriously, right, this is just another kind of thing, a way to think about their responsibility. How am I creating a space where people belong? How do I create a place where my first instinct when there's a performance issue is not severing ties? It's, okay, what if I was tied to this person for life? What would I do? How would I approach this? What resources would I bring to bear? What coaching would I bring in? Whatever that is. So yeah, great takeaways.
Well, and it's a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not you as a leader working unilaterally towards the person. It is the other person recognizing I've got a commitment to this community as well.
Yeah.
And you're moving towards each other.
Right.
Rather than chasing each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the whole notion of belonging being the barrier to community, barrier or entryway to community. That was a big aha moment takeaway for me. And when we talk about belonging, we do talk about it as a two-way street, right? Because yes, an organization has a responsibility to create an environment where people feel like they can belong, but it's also a personal choice to choose to belong and to choose to be ourselves while choosing to belong to this context, right? Belonging to myself, but also belonging to this context and this we. And that is a two-way street.
And you got to try before you know if it's going to work.
Yes. So temporary community. I'm going to explore that idea a little bit broader as well, right?
Yeah, and we didn't pull this together, but I'm not going to say there's a formula because there's a little bit more art to it than that. But there are principles in this formula of have a temporary community experience and then follow up with something like action learning to bring what happened there back in. Mm-hmm. I think when we do think about the 90s and kind of what are we going to go do a trust fall? Like we have clients all the time. You're like, are you going to make me do a trust fall? Right. There is an inoculation to things like that. And I think a big part of the reason why is that they were one-off events, right? And we know the studies have shown that, well, if you come back and you touch base monthly or whatever the cadence is, even for just 6 months, that the change that happened at that temporary community event is durable, it's sustainable. There actually are cultural changes and ways of being and ways of leading that change. So there are ways to tackle this that are pretty graspable for leaders and within reach. So Greg, if folks are interested in getting in contact with you, how would they do that? How would they buy your books?
Yeah, they're all on Amazon. So that's the easiest place to get them. You can email me at the university is probably the easiest place, grobinson@jbu.edu. And that's about it. I'm pretty low tech right now. So
yeah. And for us, purposeandperformancegroup.com, or you can find us on social channels. Would love to connect with you. If this is something that, what we're seeing is a lot of leaders are wanting belonging and community. They see it, their employees are asking for it, and they have something in themselves too that like knows something could be a little bit more fulfilling and better, but don't quite know the path there. And we'd love to talk to you. There's a lot of pretty simple solutions. So thanks so much for spending some time with us. Thank you, Greg. Appreciate
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And everyone have a great day.
Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Province, Hannah Bratteroo and Luke Freeman, and produced by Ben West. Theme music is by Evan Grimm. Title track Fake Love available on Apple Music. And this podcast was recorded at Storycatcher Studio with video and audio editing and production support by Brad O'Hara and Alicia Crum, with inspiration, strategy and technical support by yours truly, Neil Hughes. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and remember, previous episodes are available at magicintheroom.com.